At 11:47 on a Saturday night, a woman lay bleeding on a marble floor, 8 months pregnant, alone, slipping into darkness. Her husband said he was in London. He was 20 minutes away, not in a meeting, not on a plane. He was on a beach in Mexico, slipping a $200,000 diamond ring onto another woman's finger. At the exact moment his wife was being rushed into emergency surgery, he was popping a $9,000 bottle of champagne to celebrate his engagement. And when his baby daughter was born, fighting for her life in the end, ACU 4 pounds, tubes, everywhere, he walked into that hospital room with white roses, a perfect suit, and a story so smooth it almost worked. Almost. Because the woman who woke up from that surgery was not the same woman who collapsed. She had no money, no lawyer, no evidence. Her accounts were frozen. Her credit cards were cut off. A judge had just handed her own child to the man who nearly killed her. The system said she was crazy. Her husband had the paperwork to prove it, but she had something. He never counted on the truth, and one woman crazy enough to use it. What happened next didn't just destroy a billionaire's empire, it rewrote the rule book on how powerful men get away with everything and how one woman finally made them pay. This story isn't just drama, it's a masterclass in how manipulation hides in plain sight, how gaslighting works inside a marriage, and how fighting back is always possible, even when every door seems locked. If you've ever been made to feel like you were the problem, hit like right now. Drop in the comments. What was the moment you realized something was wrong? Share this with one woman who needs to hear it. And subscribe, because next week's story will make this one look like a warm-up.
The 911 call itself crackled through dispatch at 11:47 on a Saturday night, a woman's voice, shaking but fierce, piercing the static.
What bin is that?
My sister is 8 months pregnant, and there is blood everywhere. You need to send someone now. The dispatcher remained a beacon of professional calm. Ma'am, I need you to stay on the phone. What is your address? 427 Whitmore Drive in Greenwich, Connecticut. The Bennett Estate. Please, you have to hurry. She's not moving. Is she breathing? A tense pause. The sound of an ear pressed close to a pale face. Yes, just barely, but the blood... Oh God, there's so much blood. Help is on the way, ma'am. Stay with her. The call ended, but its desperate plea would set in motion a chain of events that would unravel a meticulously crafted web of deceit. For the woman on that pristine marble floor was about to learn that her dream life was a lie, and her husband, the man who swore to love her, was not where he claimed to be. He was not in London finalizing a business deal. He was, in fact, just 20 minutes down the road, tangled in the sheets of his mistress. 12 hours before that call, Rachel Bennett was the very definition of a woman who had it all. At 32 years old, her life was a fairy tale. A breathtaking Connecticut home featured in design magazines, a husband with a net worth of over $2 billion, and a baby girl just 4 weeks from arrival. The nursery was a symphony of soft pinks and creams, with tiny outfits neatly folded in drawers that cost a fortune. She was supposed to drive a brand new Tesla Model X, a safer car Marcus insisted on, while her old Honda was given away behind her back. "I'm protecting our family," he'd said, a familiar refrain. He was always protecting, always providing, always in control. Rachel was in the immense living room, placing white roses into crystal vases, preparing for the baby shower, scheduled in a few hours. 30 guests were expected, mainly the wives of Marcus's associates. Rachel's own close friends had faded away during her 3-year marriage, with only Diane remaining, and even she noted how distant Rachel had become. The first contraction seized her as she was adjusting a gift table. She caught her breath, a hand reflexively going to her belly, then dismissed it, with a laugh. Just Braxton Hicks. Her doctor said they were normal. The second one arrived 5 minutes later. It was much stronger. Rachel paused, setting down the vase to breathe through it. She told herself she was just exhausted. She'd been up all morning, insisting on arranging the decorations herself, despite the catering staff. It was one of the last parts of her life that felt entirely her own. Marcus, of course, Biesipa, had repeatedly offered to hire a professional event planner, but she had refused. She took out her phone, needing to feel connected to him, even with thousands of miles between them. "Hey, honey, shower's coming together beautifully. Missing you. Call when you can." She watched the screen, waiting for the 3 dots that would signal his reply. They never appeared. He was in London, supposedly expanding his tech empire, but for the past 2 days, every call had gone directly to voicemail. Important negotiations, his assistant, Jennifer, had explained when Rachel had called the office. He asked for no disturbances. The third contraction drove Rachel to her knees. There was no mistaking this one. The pain was a wildfire spreading through her body, stealing her breath. She clung to the gift table for support, and that's when she saw it. Blood was pooling on the white floor beneath her. Far too much blood. Her scream was swallowed by the cavernous house. Her hands shook violently as she fumbled for her phone, her vision blurring. She tried Marcus again. Voicemail. Jennifer. No answer. With her fading strength, she dialed the one person she knew would drop everything. "Tyler?" she gasped as her brother answered. "Something's wrong. The baby. So much blood." Rachel, where are you?" "Home," she whispered. "Tyler, I think I'm dying." The phone slipped from her grasp as another wave of agony washed over her. She could hear her brother's voice, small and far away, screaming her name as the world went dark. Tyler Morrison ignored every speed limit between his home in Queens and the gilded streets of Greenwich. He was a builder who drove a rusted pickup, not a billionaire. The local police should have pulled him over for doing 90 in a 55 zone, but one look at his face likely told them to stay clear. He had disliked Marcus Bennett from the start. From the moment Rachel introduced the tech mogul, something felt wrong, too perfect, too slick. But Rachel was deeply in love, convinced she'd found her happily ever after. So Tyler, like any good brother, had buried his misgivings to support his sister's happiness, even as it made his own stomach churn. He used an old emergency key she'd given him years before, back when she lived in a regular Brooklyn apartment, before she was swept into Marcus's opulent world. The front door opened to a nightmare. Rachel was a crumpled heap on the marble floor, encircled by a growing halo of crimson. Her face was ashen, her breathing terrifyingly shallow. "Rach!" He knelt beside her, his hands hovering, useless. He didn't know how to stop the bleeding, didn't know what to do except watch as his little sister slipped away. The paramedics arrived 7 minutes later, an eternity. They moved with practiced urgency, lifting Rachel onto a stretcher, their voices a confusing torrent of medical terms. Someone quizzed him on her medical history, another on allergies, and a third asked the question that hung in the air like a physical blow. Where is her husband? As the ambulance wailed towards the hospital, Tyler tried Marcus's phone again. Voicemail. Jennifer's phone. Voicemail. The main office line for Bennett Technologies was a recording. His sister was fighting for her life, and her powerful husband was unreachable. Something was deeply, horribly wrong. At the hospital, a surgeon with 23 years of experience, Dr. Patricia Williams, found Tyler in the waiting area. She had learned to deliver difficult news with both honesty and empathy. "Mr. Morrison," she began, her expression somber, seeing the man still in his work clothes, his hands stained with his sister's blood. "Ah, so that's how it all began. model. As Rachel watched, Marcus's perfectly calm expression disintegrated. She slid the legal papers across the gleaming table between them. I know about Stanford, Marcus, and I know about Victoria. The color drained from his face. The mask of the doting husband finally shattered, exposing the fraud beneath. A profound sense of peace washed over Rachel, the first she'd felt since her daughter's birth. This was the quiet, satisfying sound of justice being served. That peace had been purchased just a few days prior in a noisy Manhattan diner. A plain manila envelope was placed on the table in front of Tyler and Diane. He wasn't just being sloppy, Carl Mendez, the private investigator, stated flatly. He was being arrogant. Inside were the pictures. Marcus and Victoria Chase, a young woman, walking into a high-end apartment complex in Stamford. The timestamp on the initial photograph corresponded to the very hour Rachel was being wheeled into emergency surgery. The choice to unearth that sickening truth was made in the sterile hush of a hospital corridor. Tyler watched through the glass of Rachel's room as Marcus performed his role, stroking her hair while weaving an elaborate story about his frantic flight home from London. His phone buzzed with a message from Diane. "Are you certain? There's no turning back once she finds out." Tyler's gaze shifted from his frail, trusting sister to the man who had betrayed her. His fingers were firm as he typed his response. "She deserves to know." His performance had been worthy of an award. Marcus Bennett had strode into the hospital room at 9:15 that morning, carrying a huge bouquet of white roses, his face a perfect mask of anxiety. "Rachel, my God," he had whispered, placing a kiss on her forehead. "I got on the first flight back from London. The satellite connection was down. I didn't know a thing." The deception was so flawlessly delivered that had Tyler not seen the evidence himself, he might have been convinced. But he did have evidence. Hours before, during the endless 5-hour wait while Rachel was in surgery, a cold dread had twisted in Tyler's stomach. One more call to Marcus went directly to voicemail. It was wrong. On a gut impulse, he launched the Find My Friends app. He saw his own dot in the waiting area. He saw Rachel's in the surgical wing. And then he saw Marcus's dot, a glaring red beacon of deceit, pulsating from an address in Stamford, Connecticut. Just a 20-minute drive away, not across the Atlantic. His world had tipped sideways in that instant. The image of the map was seared into his mind as he paced the floors, running on vending machine coffee that tasted like acid. It was still there when Dr. Williams finally appeared, her scrubs marked with blood, but her voice victorious. She made it. She's a true fighter. Tears of relief for his sister mixed with a new, icy rage for her husband. He met his niece, Emma, a 4-pound miracle in an incubator, her little chest rising and falling. He laid his palm against the glass. "Your mom is going to be all right," he murmured. "And I promise, I'll make your dad face what he did." It was then he spotted Diane rushing toward him, her expression frantic with fear. Without a word, he pulled out his phone and showed her the screenshot that would set the truth in motion. Diane's face grew rigid as she stared at the map. "That son of a bitch," she breathed, instantly understanding the implication. "I know someone," she said after a long pause. "A private investigator. He's expensive, but he is the best there is." The whole disaster, the lies, the private investigator, the shattered trust. It all started with a doctor's somber pronouncement in a quiet hallway. "Your sister has had a severe placental abruption," Dr. Williams said, her gaze filled with sincere concern. "There's massive internal bleeding. We have to perform an emergency cesarean right now. This situation is life-threatening for both of them." Tyler's head spun, unable to grasp the sudden terror of it all. The doctor held out a clipboard. "I'll need your signature on the consent forms. You're listed as Rachel's emergency contact." Tyler could only look back at her. A single, stunned question hanging in the air. I am? What about her husband? What's happening? Who is everyone? Rachel asked, her voice trembling. This is Margaret Ellis, Marcus began, his tone dripping with false sorrow. She's a supervisor appointed by the court. A supervisor for what? He let out a heavy sigh, a performance of pure regret. Rachel, I hoped it wouldn't come to this, but your erratic behavior lately is a threat to Emma's safety. The room seemed to tilt under her feet. My behavior? These paranoid claims hiring investigators, this wild idea I was with another woman instead of working abroad, he said, shaking his head. Dr. Patterson is worried it might be postpartum psychosis. I don't have that, she shot back. Denial is a common symptom, Margaret interjected coolly, along with delusions and an inability to tell what's real. A chill washed over Rachel. This couldn't be real. What are you trying to say? The police officer took a step closer. The officer looked uneasy with his duty. Mrs. Bennett, a temporary court order has been issued. It limits your contact with your daughter until you've had a psychiatric assessment. Limit my contact? She's my baby. She'll be safe with your husband while you get the support you need, Margaret said. Marcus moved toward her, arms open. Honey, I know this is awful, but it's for Emma's good. We need you to get well, Rachel recoiled. Get away from me. Margaret scribbled on her clipboard. See, paranoid avoidance, a textbook case. I'm not paranoid. I have evidence he was unfaithful. What evidence? Marcus asked, his voice a mask of reason. Proof I was in a colleague's apartment on business, pictures from a team dinner. Rachel, a sick mind, sees threats where there are none. The photos, the travel logs, the ring. But this ambush was exactly what she had prepared for. Just days earlier, she had stood with her hands pressed to Emma's incubator, her tears fueled not by sadness, but by pure fury. He knew, she'd whispered to Tyler. 2 days before I ended up here, I told him I felt sick. He knew, and he still went to Mexico with her. He kissed me goodbye that morning, told me he loved me, all while planning to give another woman a ring. Tyler had watched the trusting, naive girl he knew vanish, replaced by someone sharp and resolute. How long has this been happening? She'd asked. Carl's still investigating, but it looks like at least 6 trips this past year, all disguised as work. She was silent for a while, her hand on the incubator's shell. When she finally spoke, her voice was firm. I need it all. Every flight. Every deception. Every cent he spent on her. I need the receipts. The pictures. All of it. Rach, shouldn't you just rest? This can all wait, Tyler had pleaded. No, she said, turning to him, her eyes like flint. It can't. Because he'll come back with a story for everything. He'll twist it all until I feel like I'm the crazy one. Like it's my fault. Tyler knew she was right. Marcus was a master manipulator. But if I have proof, she'd continued, her voice gaining strength, undeniable proof he can't talk his way out of, then I'll have the advantage. For the first time in 3 years, I'll have control. What's your plan? He'd asked. Gazing at her tiny daughter, sleeping amidst the medical equipment, she had made a promise. I'm going to shield my little girl, and I'm going to make Marcus Bennett answer for every lie. That resolve was forged in the fire of betrayal. After a moment's hesitation, Tyler had shown her the evidence on his phone, a map screenshot, then the pictures. Rachel's face was a canvas of shifting emotions as she swiped through them, first puzzlement, then denial, and finally a deep, vacant shock that felt more painful than any outburst would have. This can't be right, she whispered, her eyes fixed on the photo of Marcus and Victoria on the beach. He was in London. There must be some mistake. Rach, the airline records are clear, Tyler said gently. Her scrolling stopped abruptly on the image of Victoria's hand and the enormous diamond it held. Her own hand went to her wedding ring, a modest 3-carat stone that had once felt so grand. Next to Victoria's, it seemed insignificant. He asked her to marry him, she stated, her voice devoid of emotion. While I was pregnant with his baby, he got engaged to someone else. 3 weeks ago. After a long, heavy silence, she shut off the phone and returned it to Tyler. Take me to see Emma. We need to discuss this, Rach. Get a lawyer involved. I need to see my daughter, she repeated. Helping her into a wheelchair, Tyler heard a familiar tone in her voice, the same quiet strength she'd found after their dad left, the grit that got her through college and helped her build a career before Marcus talked her into quitting. The fighter, Rachel Morrison, was coming back. But that fighting spirit had first flickered to life just hours before, when Tyler walked into her hospital room. She was sitting up, color in her face and a focus in her gaze he hadn't seen for a long time. I have to talk to you, she'd said, her voice firm. Shut the door. His heart pounded as he obeyed. I've just been lying here thinking, she went on, about everything. The night I passed out, Marcus being impossible to reach, and how he somehow managed to get on the first plane out of London as soon as he heard. Rach, you should be resting, he'd urged. I'm through with resting, she replied calmly. I've had 3 days to do nothing but piece things together, and his story is full of holes. What are you talking about? He claimed he was in critical meetings, that the satellite phones were out, that he rushed right here from the plane. She just shook her head. Tyler, I know my own husband. After a flight that long, he's a wreck. His suit is creased. He has that tired travel look. But when he got here, he was pristine. Perfect suit, perfect hair, like he'd just stepped out of his own shower. Her eyes locked onto his, cutting through all the pretense. He wasn't in London, was he? The direct question, born from a wife's intuition, was what had finally forced the truth into the open, compelling Tyler to reveal everything he knew. Rachel's husband, Marcus, waited for her in the formal living room, his voice dripping with false concern. Please sit down, he said. We need to talk. He was not by himself. A polished, older woman, with the air of an expensive lawyer, sat beside him on the white sofa, and standing behind them, a man in a police uniform. Rachel felt a chill run through her, a stark contrast to the warmth she had felt just hours before. This was a trap, and she had walked right into it. How could everything have gone so wrong, so fast? The night before had been a celebration. Diane had brought champagne, Tyler had shown up with pizza, and they had toasted to the future. To karma, finally doing its job, Diane had cheered. To my sister, Tyler added, who's about to take that snake for everything he's worth. For the first time in months, Rachel had felt a wave of genuine happiness wash over her as she smiled and raised her glass. Their joy was fueled by a 7 a.m. phone call. It was her lawyer, Helena, her usually calm voice electric with excitement. We got them, she'd said. Her team had found it all. Bennett Technologies had been funneling money for the past 2 years through offshore accounts, using shell companies and tax avoidance schemes that bordered on fraud. The evidence was undeniable, the key to protecting her daughter Emma's future. The breakthrough was a testament to their daring plan. To uncover the truth, Helena had explained, they needed Marcus to believe he had already won. They needed him to get careless. So Rachel played her part, returning to the Greenwich mansion and pretending to be the grateful wife. Even as Marcus poured champagne and spoke of promoting his mistress, Victoria, as a supposed sacrifice for his family. Rich men like Marcus assume women like you will accept whatever they're given, Helena had told her, her eyes sharp and assessing. We use that arrogance against him. The plan was risky, but brilliant. Rachel would act like the defeated wife, focused only on Emma's health, while Helena's team conducted a forensic accounting investigation and a private investigator dug into Victoria's background. The strategy had been born out of a stark reality check in Helena's Midtown office. At 48, Helena Cross had built a reputation as Manhattan's most effective divorce attorney by dismantling powerful men. "Your case is a nightmare," she had stated bluntly, "but it's a nightmare with potential." The bad news was the prenuptial agreement Rachel had signed without reading, an agreement Helena described as essentially bulletproof. "So what makes circumstances abnormal?" Rachel had asked, her heart sinking. Helena explained that if they could prove the marriage was based on false pretenses, or that Marcus was already engaged in deceptive practices when the prenup was signed, they might be able to have it thrown out entirely. The private investigator had already documented 18 months of Marcus's trips with Victoria, a timeline that predated Emma's conception. That was helpful, but it wasn't enough. They needed proof of financial deception, evidence of hidden assets, something concrete to show that Marcus was planning to leave while keeping her completely in the dark. Rachel had looked at the framed newspaper articles covering Helena's past victories, each one featuring a wealthy husband who had underestimated her. "What if I fight and lose everything?" she had asked. Helena leaned in. "Then you lose it with your dignity intact." The entire war began not with a bang, but quietly, in a hotel room near the hospital, where her daughter, Emma, was still fighting for her life in the NICU. Rachel, finally discharged 2 weeks after her collapse, couldn't bear returning to the mansion and its haunting memories. Her friend Diane helped her settle in, bringing takeout, wine, and the kind of steadfast friendship that Rachel desperately needed. As Diane poured 2 generous glasses of Pinot Noir, she asked the simple question that would change everything. "So, what's the plan?" Rachel looked out at the city lights, the image of her tiny, fragile daughter in an incubator burning in her mind. She knew she had to fight. "First," she said, her voice steady with newfound resolve, "I need a lawyer, a good one, someone who isn't afraid to go up against a billionaire." And Tyler knew because of a man who closed his notebook and promised, "Give me a week. I'll get you the full story on your boy Marcus." 3 days into it, the PI, Carl, delivered his first update. "Your brother-in-law hasn't set foot in London for half a year," Carl had stated. "His jet, tail number, November 787 Romeo Mike, was filed for Heathrow last week, but that plan was changed twice. He went to Los Angeles, then to Cabo San Lucas, Mexico. He touched down there the very night your sister was hospitalized." Tyler's blood had run cold. "Immigration confirms 2 people on that plane, Marcus Bennett and a Victoria Chase. They checked into the Casa del Mar Resort, presidential suite, for 4 nights." Tyler had squeezed his eyes shut. He'd suspected, but the confirmation was a physical blow. "There's more," Carl had said. "I know a guy in Cabo, a photographer for the tabloids. He sent me pictures." The photos were spread across Carl's desk. Marcus and Victoria, hand in hand, on a beach, a candlelit dinner. A kiss, but the worst was at the spa. Marcus's wedding band sitting on a table, and on Victoria's finger, an engagement ring glittered in the sun. "That thing is enormous," Tyler had breathed. "At least 5 carats, Carl agreed. "A jeweler I know puts it north of $200,000. Marcus had always told Rachel he'd upgrade her ring someday. He just did it for someone else. "He proposed to Victoria 3 weeks ago," Carl continued, showing him a restaurant receipt. "In Malibu, after a $9,000 bottle of champagne." Tyler felt a wave of nausea. It wasn't just cheating. It was an entire other life. And as he stared at the evidence, he faced an impossible question. How could he tell his sister, lying weak in a hospital bed, that her whole world was a lie? So that's how it was. With the papers signed, it was over. David Stone's voice on the phone was cautious but clear. "Miss Bennett?" He agreed to everything. Full custody is yours, the prenup is void, and the $50 million settlement is confirmed. Rachel felt tears tracing paths down her cheeks as she whispered a thank you. He'd actually caved. It seemed he had, but David's tone remained measured. This outcome, this total surrender, had seemed impossible just days ago. It all hinged on one last, desperate confrontation where she had cornered him, watching the confidence drain from his face as he finally weighed his options and saw no way out. She hadn't slept for days leading up to that meeting, haunted by his calculated expression. Pushing him into a corner felt like baiting a dangerous animal. At 11:45, a text from an unknown number had lit up her phone. Document signed. "Being delivered to your lawyer now." She had immediately dialed David Stone, the unbuyable lawyer Evelyn recommended, her heart pounding. Could it truly be finished? That victory was born from her lowest point, from finding herself a billionaire's wife with frozen accounts, declined credit cards, and nowhere to go but her friend Diane's tiny Queens apartment. Lying on Diane's worn-out sofa, staring at the ceiling, Rachel had plotted how to fight back after her life had been so completely dismantled. Marcus had won, or so he thought. She had no lawyer, no proof, and worst of all, no way to see her daughter. "What am I going to do?" she had whispered into the dark. Diane had taken her hand, her grip firm. "You're going to fight. You're the strongest person I know." But strength felt useless when she was barred from the hospital, stopped by a guard at the NICU entrance while Marcus played the part of the devoted father to their baby girl, Emma, just beyond the glass. "Your visitation has been restricted pending a court review," the guard had said, his discomfort obvious. Restricted. Supervised visits, once a week, for a single hour. She had pounded on the glass, screaming his name, as security escorted her away. Outside, Diane was in tears. "I'm so sorry, Rach. Helena's firm dropped you. Carl's office was robbed. Every file, every photo is gone." In the 3 days she was locked away, Marcus had used his vast resources to buy off or intimidate everyone who could help her and methodically erase every piece of evidence she had. The key to her eventual victory came from an unexpected visitor on her 3rd day inside that gilded cage. A staff member had approached her in the common room. "Mrs. Bennett, your mother-in-law is here." But Marcus's mother had passed away when he was a boy. In the visitor's room sat an elegant, silver-haired woman who radiated old money. "My name is Evelyn Grant," she said, her voice urgent. "Please sit. We don't have much time." Rachel, numb and confused, obeyed, unsure what new horror this was. "I'm Victoria Chase's former mother-in-law," Evelyn explained, her words sharp with controlled fury. "Though her real name is Amber Jenkins. She's a professional con artist." Rachel's world tilted. "But Marcus was cheating on me." "Of course he was," Evelyn countered grimly. "And he's also being played." She finds unhappy men, gives them an excuse to leave, and positions herself to profit from the fallout. Evelyn had seen the news of Rachel's sudden psychiatric commitment and recognized the playbook Amber had used on her own son, Robert, a playbook that cost their family $4 million and nearly ruined their reputation. "I will not let her destroy another family," Evelyn stated, her eyes hard as steel. She slid a business card across the table. "This is a real lawyer, one your husband can't buy." As she stood to leave, she gave Rachel one last crucial piece of advice. "Do not let them convince you that you are crazy." That warning echoed in Rachel's mind as she was released after the mandatory 72-hour hold with a diagnosis of significant stress but no psychosis. It was the first step toward reclaiming her life. Before Evelyn's arrival, that felt impossible. Inside the Pinehurst Wellness Center, a discreet facility for the wealthy, Rachel was trapped. They took her phone, her clothes, even her wedding ring. A kind-faced psychiatrist, Dr. Morris, listened patiently as she explained her situation. "My husband is trying to steal my daughter," she told him. He made a note. "He says you've been having paranoid thoughts, believing he was having an affair." "I have photographs," she insisted, her throat tight. "Do you have them with you?" he asked gently. "No, they took my phone." Dr. Morris calmly explained that Marcus had provided flight records showing he was in London, not Mexico. He had statements from colleagues. He even had proof the other woman was in Singapore at the time. "Is it possible," the doctor suggested, "that the stress and trauma of your difficult pregnancy have affected your perception?" He wasn't being cruel. He genuinely believed the fabricated evidence. She wasn't just fighting a cheating husband. She was fighting a system designed to swallow her whole, a system that had just stripped her of her daughter and declared her an unfit mother. The documents arrived by courier just 5 minutes before her noon deadline. Signed, notarized, final. As Rachel held them, the gray morning rain finally stopped, and a sliver of sunlight broke through the clouds. It was over. But this victory was born from a desperate gamble made in a dark apartment, a decision that terrified everyone around her. It began when she told her sister, "I want to give Marcus a choice. The same choice he gave me. Surrender everything, or watch your world burn." That ultimatum was delivered in person, at a neutral restaurant in Greenwich. Marcus had walked in wearing an expensive suit and a confident smile. Treating her like an unstable ex, he was humoring. He was blindsided when she played a 30-second clip from her phone. His own voice, cold and calculated, detailing his plot. "The postpartum psychosis angle is perfect," it echoed between them. His face went pale. He stammered that the evidence was illegal, inadmissible. Rachel just smiled. "Maybe not in court," she'd said, "but it would make fascinating listening for your investors." His arrogance crumbled when she slid a printed email across the table, showing correspondence with a top journalist from the Wall Street Journal. "What do you want?" he finally asked, his voice tight. She laid out her terms: full custody of Emma, the prenup voided, and $50 million. The last condition was absolute. He would disappear from their lives forever. He called it absurd. She simply stood up, told him he had until Monday to decide, and walked away without looking back, leaving him to stare at the ruins of his carefully constructed life. That entire confrontation was meticulously planned in her sister Diane's tiny living room, alongside the very woman who had helped Marcus destroy her life. "Let me get this straight," her brother Tyler had said, pacing. "The woman who helped wreck my sister's life is now our best ally? She's our only ally," Rachel had insisted. "And she has the evidence that can win this." Diane was terrified, calling it blackmail against a powerful, dangerous man. But Rachel's voice was steady. "I'm talking about fighting fire with fire. He used his money to crush me. Well, now I have something he can't buy, the truth." The truth was a catalog of horrors contained on a single USB drive. Amber, the woman Rachel had known as Victoria, sat with her as they listened for hours. They heard Marcus and his mother strategize how to frame her for fraud. They heard him admit to fabricating her psychiatric records and bribing officials to keep Emma away from her permanently. His voice, once a source of comfort, now sounded monstrously cold, discussing her as a problem to be managed. The affair, she realized, was never the real betrayal. It was just one piece of a systematic plan to erase her. The most chilling part of the recordings was a conversation with Amber herself. "And what about me?" Amber's voice asked. "What's my role after the divorce is final. Marcus had promised her she would be a handsomely rewarded stepmother to Emma. He'd laughed about how he'd already bought Rachel's lawyer and had the private investigator on his payroll. He was certain that once she was committed for a psychiatric evaluation, no one would ever believe a word she said. The plan had been in motion long before their daughter was even conceived. This devastating evidence came from that unlikely ally. Amber Jenkins, a professional con artist who went by Victoria Chase, had appeared on Rachel's doorstep looking like a ghost. She confessed her entire scheme, explaining that she targeted wealthy, vain men who were already on the path to destroying their families. She just sped up the process and took a cut. But Marcus, she explained, was different. He wasn't just pathetic, he was a monster. He had wrapped his hands around her throat and threatened to destroy her, just as he had destroyed Rachel. Amber had come not from a guilty conscience, but from pure terror. She had been recording her conversations with Marcus for months as an insurance policy, and things had finally gone very, very bad. She placed the USB drive on the coffee table, a small piece of plastic holding the power to ruin an empire. Rachel stared at her. This woman who had slept in her bed and played mother to her child and felt not sympathy, but a grim recognition. She knew what it was like to believe you were in control, only to discover you were just a pawn on someone else's board. She almost hadn't let her in. When the knock came that Tuesday morning, Rachel's hand trembled on the doorknob. Every instinct screamed at her not to open the door to the woman who had shattered her world. But curiosity and one desperate promise won out. Through the door, the woman said, "I can help you get Emma back." That was the only thing that could have made Rachel turn the lock, because at that moment, she was utterly broken. For 2 weeks, she had lived in a fog of despair. She pumped breast milk for a daughter she was not allowed to see. She applied for jobs that would never hire her, her name now toxic from news articles about a messy, high-profile divorce. Every lawyer she called refused her case the moment they heard she was up against Marcus Bennett. The system had done its job efficiently. She had $47 in her wallet, a daughter she could not see, a husband who had convinced the world she was crazy, and absolutely nothing left to lose. She just didn't realize yet how that made her the most dangerous woman he could possibly imagine. And it all started because she thought she had him. Armed with Helena's evidence and Carl's photographs, she had walked into their home ready for a fight. But Marcus simply spread his hands. "What photographs? What flight records, darling? I've been in London." He held up his left hand, his wedding band gleaming. "I'm already married to the love of my life." As her mind reeled, a woman named Margaret interjected, speaking of an evaluation. That's when the officer shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, I have a court order here. I am required to escort you to Pinehurst Wellness Center." And in that moment, she saw it all. The pained love on Marcus's face was a mask, and she had just walked straight into a perfectly laid trap. As the Vermont sun painted the mountains in fiery crimson and gold, Rachel Bennett watched her daughter play, a portrait of peace. This time, there would be no running. He wanted a fight? Fine. She would give him a war. She walked to the closet and retrieved a box, unopened for over a year, filled with the insurance policy Margaret Bennett had given her, proof of every crime, every victim, every secret Marcus had ever buried. She spread the files across her kitchen table and began making calls. The fairy tale had ended the day she bled out on a marble floor, but the real story, her story, was just beginning, and she would be the one to write the ending. But this newfound strength was forged in terror. Just weeks earlier, her world had tilted on its axis once more. She saw a delivery truck a man in uniform on her porch with a small package. Inside, a single photograph. Marcus on a beach, holding a baby boy. On the back, 4 chilling words in his handwriting. "See you soon." Her heart hammered against her ribs as she stared at the image. Marcus was supposed to be in a cell for 25 years, with no chance of parole. With trembling hands, she dialed her lawyer, David Stone. "Mr. Stone," she said, her voice tight. "It's Rachel." The phone line was silent for a moment too long. "Mrs. Morrison," David's voice was grave, "I have difficult news. There was an incident during a prison transport 3 weeks ago. Marcus escaped." Escaped? It seemed impossible. "He had help on the inside," David explained. "We believe he'd been planning it for months. He's fled the country, somewhere without extradition." The ground gave way beneath her, that familiar, sickening drop. But this time, she wasn't the same woman. She looked at her daughter, Emma, playing in the yard, and then back at the photo. He wanted her to live in fear, to look over her shoulder for the rest of her life. He wanted the old Rachel. The old Rachel was gone, replaced by a woman who had survived a cold cell in the Manhattan detention center, the one that smelled of despair. It was there, at 2 in the morning, that a guard had announced a visitor. She expected her lawyer, maybe her friend. Instead, she found an elegant, silver-haired woman bathed in the harsh fluorescent light of the visiting room. "My name is Margaret Bennett," the woman had said. "I am Marcus's mother." Rachel froze. He had told her his mother was dead. "It is easier," Margaret explained, "than admitting she refuses to speak to him. My son has become a monster, and I will not let him destroy another innocent woman." The verdict was guilty on every charge, followed by a sentence of 25 years without parole. Margaret's email explained that testifying against her son was the most difficult, yet necessary, thing she had ever done. Justice was owed to Elizabeth, to Rachel, and to the world. She wished Rachel and Emma peace, reminding her of her own strength. Rachel scanned the message twice before deleting it. Marcus Bennett was a ghost from a past life. He had no place in her, here and now. Months later, grading papers on a crisp autumn morning, a sudden knock on her door made her look up from the kitchen table. Through the window, she saw a figure she wasn't expecting. That quiet evening, sitting on her porch with a glass of wine, was a universe away from her former life. Diane's voice echoed in her memory. She could have remained wealthy, in the city, with servants and a life of leisure. But that was never her goal. She had simply lost her way. Most of the settlement money was now funding charities. She kept enough for a comfortable life, ensuring Emma's security, but not so much that it would erase the person she was. Practical, hardworking, and now, finally, free. As the stars blanketed the sky, a quiet she'd never known in the city, her phone vibrated. It was an email from Margaret Bennett, the subject line simply reading, "Update." On the porch of her Vermont farmhouse, Rachel watched the sun dip below the mountains. Emma, now 2, chased fireflies across the lawn, her laughter pure and untouched by the darkness of her first year. This was home. Her part-time job, teaching English at the local high school, gave her a new identity. Mrs. Morrison, the kind teacher who understood second chances. Her students knew nothing of the billionaire, the betrayal, or the brutal fight for her survival. They only knew her kindness. When Tyler and Diane visited from New York, squeezing into his truck for the long drive, they saw the life she had chosen. Just a year before, that peace was unimaginable. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning outside the Manhattan Federal Courthouse. Rachel watched from across the street, Emma finally safe in her arms, after a judge reversed the custody order, citing massive fraud. On a massive screen, Margaret Bennett stood before a sea of reporters and systematically dismantled her own son's life. For 20 years, she had gathered the evidence, proof of stolen patents, illegal contracts, and widespread bribery, and now she was laying it all bare for the world to see. Margaret's voice was resolute as she exposed the respectable facade her son, Marcus Bennett, had built over 2 decades. The screen scrolled with irrefutable proof of his crimes. Then came the final blow. Margaret announced she was giving prosecutors evidence suggesting his first wife's death was no accident. The press erupted. Somewhere in Greenwich, Marcus Bennett saw his world implode. He was arrested later that afternoon at JFK Airport, trying to escape on a private jet to a country with no extradition treaty. The image of the brilliant CEO in handcuffs became the lead story on every channel. In Diane's apartment, watching the news coverage with a sleeping Emma in her arms, Rachel felt empty. When Tyler asked how she felt, she couldn't summon triumph or glee. There was only a profound weariness. "I just want it to be over," she admitted, tired of Marcus Bennett occupying every thought. "Then let it be," Diane urged. "Take the settlement, take your daughter, and build something beautiful." 6 weeks later, the divorce was finalized. With the prenup invalidated by fraud, Rachel received full custody and a settlement of $120 million. More than money, it was her freedom. On a sunny April morning, she packed the last box into a moving truck. This move to a Vermont farmhouse was her chance at a new life, a place where no one knew the name Bennett. "You sure about this?" Tyler asked, worried about her leaving the city and her family. But Rachel knew she needed a place where she could just be Rachel Morrison, a mother starting over. After a fierce hug from Diane and a promise to call, text, and send daily pictures, she drove away. The Manhattan skyline, the backdrop to her nightmare, shrank in her rearview mirror until it vanished completely. Ahead lay an unknown road and a future she couldn't predict. But for the first time in years, Rachel felt a flicker of hope. That hope had been born in a lawyer's office, just 72 hours after her arrest, when the federal charges against her were suddenly dropped. Sitting with Margaret, Tyler, and Diane, Rachel was bewildered. "Why now? Why help me?" she asked. Margaret explained it was because Rachel was the first one who had fought Marcus and survived. The others had been silenced with settlements or had simply given up. By refusing to break, Rachel had shown Margaret that winning was possible. It wasn't just about helping Rachel. It was about stopping a son who had to utterly destroy any enemy he couldn't control. "He can't leave enemies behind," Margaret's voice had been grim. "If you had quietly taken a settlement, he might have let you go, but you threatened him." The only option left, Margaret declared, was to destroy him first. Her plan was devastatingly simple. Marcus's entire empire was built on the lie of his genius. In reality, it was a house of cards constructed from stolen ideas, bribery, and illegal tactics. Margaret had the documents to prove it all: patents taken from small inventors, blackmailed contracts, and fraudulent financial records. She had been too afraid to use them before. The fear had paralyzed her for years. Marcus had the resources to crush her if she failed, leaving no one to stop him. "What changed?" Rachel had asked. "You did," Margaret answered simply. Rachel's fight showed her that the system could work if one was brave enough to use it. That bravery was a stark contrast to her situation just days earlier, locked in a jail cell, convinced her life was over. It was there Margaret had found her, explaining that the arrest was just a game to keep her contained while Marcus executed his real plan. It was then Margaret revealed her own secret weapon. Amber Jenkins, the woman who betrayed Rachel, had been working for Margaret all along. She also shared the chilling story of Marcus's first wife, Elizabeth, who died in a convenient car accident just before their divorce was finalized. A divorce initiated after she found evidence of his affairs, his financial crimes, and his abuse, and was about to leave with their son. Another woman. The words hung in the air. His first wife, Elizabeth. Margaret continued, her voice low. The official story is that she died in a car accident 8 years ago. The unofficial story is that she tried to leave him. That night, Margaret gave Rachel the ammunition she now held in her Vermont farmhouse, the box of files that would dismantle Marcus's empire piece by piece. It was the key to surviving what had happened just hours before she met Margaret, the moment her life had been systematically ripped apart. It had happened with the slam of a police car door. As the cold metal of handcuffs bit into her wrists, Rachel's gaze was fixed on Amber, who stood frozen, staring at the floor. You, Rachel breathed. The betrayal, a physical blow. You set me up. Amber's eyes, finally meeting hers, were filled with tears. I'm sorry, Rachel, she whispered. He threatened my family. I didn't have a choice. The recordings, Amber explained, had been real but doctored, edited to paint Rachel as the criminal. As officers led her away, Diane's screams and Tyler's shouts faded into a distant echo. Through the cruiser's window, Amber mouthed two final, useless words. I'm sorry. The arrest had been a blur of flashing lights and disbelief. A detective, his face weary, held up a badge. Rachel Morrison Bennett, he announced. You are under arrest for wire fraud and extortion. Her world tilted. We have evidence, he said flatly, that you attempted to blackmail Marcus Bennett using illegally obtained recordings and conspired with Amber Jenkins to defraud his company. It was insane, a perfectly constructed lie. But the warrant was real, the evidence convincing. They'd come for her in the one place she felt safe, surrounded by the people she loved. And it all started with a celebration. That evening, in Diane's apartment, they toasted her victory with champagne while Tyler brought pizza. Even Amber was there, looking cautiously hopeful. To getting your life back, Diane said, raising her glass. To Emma, Tyler added, who is finally going to have her mother back. Rachel smiled, but a cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. The victory felt too easy. Men like Marcus Bennett didn't just surrender $50 million and walk away. He didn't lose gracefully. She was missing something. The answer came at 9:17 with a hard, insistent pounding on the door. NYPD, open up! Rachel Morrison's victory proved something powerful men want you to forget. The truth can't be bought off, buried under paperwork, or silenced by a bogus diagnosis. This win wasn't just personal, it was a landmark. But that public moment of justice was the end of a long, secret war. A war that started with quiet calls to reporters and hushed conversations with other women Marcus had wronged. An alliance was forming, a plan was taking shape, all to build a permanent shield for her daughter. That's what mothers do. They dig in, they survive, and they refuse to lose. This story was for every woman made to feel insane for trusting her own instincts, for every mother who fought a desperate battle to protect her child. It was a sign for anyone crushed by wealth and influence that sometimes the system can be forced to work. Rachel didn't just save herself. She created a blueprint for survival. And it all began with a single, quiet moment. Before the fight, Rachel watched her daughter play as the sun went down, memorizing how the fading light caught her dark hair, how her laugh was like music, and how her little hands reached for the flickering fireflies, dancing just out of her grasp. In that moment, a silent vow was made. I will protect you, no matter what it takes. And that is where this entire journey began. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Your click signals that stories of truth and resilience matter. Tell us below which moment struck you the most. Your comments create a community where survivors connect and realize they aren't alone. Share this video with one person, because knowing how manipulation works is a form of armor. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and turn on notifications, because next week's story will challenge your ideas of trust and betrayal. Remember, you are stronger than the people who try to break you and smarter than those who look down on you. Until next time, fight for your truth. Final disclaimer. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.